If you're a lawyer and you are submitting a Freedom of Information Act request or FOIA request to a government agency, you should brace yourself for delays and for there to be a backlog in processing those requests. And that's what I want to talk about in this video to give those of you who are going into law practice some realistic expectations or ideas about how FOIA works in practice. Perhaps the most intractable problem with compliance with the Freedom of Information Act by federal agencies is the failure to meet deadlines and to respond to FOIA requests and the agency backlogs, huge agency backlogs of these requests. It's very expensive to have staff available, the personnel to process the requests and find the records that somebody's asking for, and so forth. There's actually widespread concerns year after year across the federal government about how FOIA gets bogged down and isn't working as well as it could be, whether it's congressional committees complaining about this or the Government Accountability Office or nonprofit groups that say FOIA isn't really achieving its original purpose. I think I mentioned in another video from my administrative law course that the statutory deadline for responding to requests is 20 days, but in reality, a lot of times it takes more than 40 days for the agency to respond just because of the backlog. And a tiny fraction, maybe 14% or so, are actually processed within that statutory deadline. And a small number actually take a really long time, like more than a year to process. According to some annual reports, at any given time, there could be more than 200,000 pending FOIA requests across the federal government that are already past their deadline. There's occasional stories about requests that have taken multiple years for the government to process or to respond to or to turn over the requested documents. But those are the outliers, but it's actually normal to at least run past the deadline. If the answer from the agency is adverse, if they basically say, we don't have to give you that information or we're not going to, they have to provide for an administrative appeal process within the agency that has to be resolved or is supposed to be resolved within 20 business days before you would even go to court to litigate. On the other hand, and we have a section about exhaustion of administrative remedies that we get to at the end of my administrative law course, but if the agency fails to comply with the applicable time limits in the statute, a court may deem the requester to have exhausted their administrative remedies. So if they filed a request for an administrative review of a denial and they never hear back about that administrative review, eventually they might go into court and the court may find that they exhausted their administrative remedies even though they never got an answer. In theory, the requester is entitled to bring a suit in federal court on day 21 after they have brought that administrative appeal if they got no response. That said, the people who submit the FOIA requests rarely go rushing into court immediately. The more common practice is to wait many months and file repeated requests and follow up with the agency several times before resorting to litigation. The delays can be frustrating, and I hope that we can reform the system and resolve this, but should also keep in mind that the federal government some years receives more than 1 million FOIA requests. There's a lot of FOIA requests that are submitted every year. It's a lot to process. If you are filing a FOIA request with a federal agency, it's very unlikely that yours is the only request that they have that they've had come in that month. Also, keep in mind that only about 3% of the requests actually come from journalists or media outlets or news reporters. In other words, FOIA is serving less of a function for government oversight and transparency with regards to the press than was originally expected when Congress enacted the statute. About 2/3 of the FOIA requests that the federal government receives are what's called first-person requests. This is where an individual or an entity is actually submitting a FOIA request to find out what the government has about them, what information that agency has on file about the requester himself or herself. And about 8% are from for-profit entities that are trying to collect information that they will compile and publish or disseminate for a fee. Basically, they're using FOIA as a way to get information that they think will be valuable to their customers and they could actually sell to others. And that concludes this quick overview of how FOIA works in practice and some of the FOIA backlogs.
It was released in '66 under the Freedom of Information Act.
It's called the Freedom of Information Act, Kate.
Haven't you heard of the Freedom of Information Act?
The Freedom of Information Act doesn't quite cover suits by robots.